In the process of researching my next video, I discovered on Laruelle's Wikipedia page that he passed away last year on the 28th of October at the age of 87. Because Laruelle is not a mainstream philosopher and because of his advancing age, I anticipated learning of his death in this way. I found a couple of tributes to his life and work on social media, but his passing has gone unnoticed even by many intellectuals and philosophers in similar fields. As if speaking to this hidden nature of his life and project, a quote on his death notice reads, "The universe was in the world, and the world did not see it." Laruelle's work, much like the Gnostic and hidden schools of thought he evoked, operates with different goals and axioms than mainstream philosophy. He was, and still is, present within the world of philosophy and the world according to philosophy, yet he remains largely unseen, unacknowledged, and misunderstood. In a sense, this speaks to the success of Laruelle's project, which is to think with philosophy and everything else according to the real, in ways philosophy cannot. What Laruelle means by philosophy can be as broad or narrow as you like, because it doesn't describe a particular discipline or school of thought, but a style of thought with a specific structure, which I'll begin to describe in this video. Put differently, Laruelle sees philosophy as a posture one assumes in relation to the real. For Laruelle, the real is the ultimate irreducible reality that exists beyond all philosophical interpretation, representation, or conceptualization. It is not transcendent or metaphysical, but immanent and lived, already here. It is in this respect that his project remains hidden, for how uninteresting it is to philosophy and its citizens. Other continents of thought exist. Many philosophers and especially anthropologists know this, but Laruelle's project might be the only truly decolonizing reaction to that realization because there is no analysis or eventual integration on the horizon, only a dualysis, a holding off, not to maintain difference, but to discover an identity determined in the last instance. Last instance, not merely as a final point in time, but as a fundamental determination both ultimate and originary that's already here. In this sense, Laruelle's non-philosophy is a practice that cannot step into the light of Western thought, because it cannot think as an occupying force. It's too immanent to the force of thought itself for there to be anything to occupy. But while Laruelle's project might never be popular from the perspective of philosophy, non-philosophy itself is already more than popular. Against philosophy, and in the broad sense, non-philosophy is everything else. Laruelle is simply pointing to that ordinary life outside the limits of philosophy we all already know and have, subordinating philosophy to it and holding it to account, to liberate philosophy from itself and its self-endowed sufficiency.
This limitation is not my problem, but the limitation of philosophy is no longer here itself philosophical.
The world need not only be understood with philosophy, science, or their mixtures, for example in the social sciences. This is especially true when it comes to understanding philosophy itself. Of course, philosophy claims to be sufficient for its own self-explanation, but why should we take this circular performance at its word? The philosophers we celebrate the most, we do so for their familiarity against the real, for how they can provide frameworks to soften its impact, for how they conceal the real from us by reducing it into their models. The world, society, etc. resists true originality through this feature of philosophy that conceals the real. When philosophy sees evidence of this concealment, it attributes it to the things themselves and does not recognize it as a symptom of philosophy itself. For example, Deleuze said, "Things and people are always forced to conceal themselves, have to conceal themselves when they begin." What else could they do? They come into being within a set that no longer includes them and, in order not to be rejected, have to project the characteristics which they retain in common with the set. Deleuze is saying novelty has to be snuck in so that it looks like something familiar for us to accept it. One of his examples is early cinema, which was shot and filmed to look like the theatre, and the unique essence of the cinema was only discovered later. But while philosophers, ideologies, and even new technologies like AI must, as Deleuze says, conceal themselves in the beginning in order not to be philosophically rejected, that which conceals what is novel and singular, that which conceals the real itself, is philosophy. The originality Deleuze is describing that gets discovered later emerges despite philosophy's best efforts to subdue it. The real persists despite philosophy. It necessarily overcomes philosophical resistance, though philosophy continues to overestimate, to hallucinate, its ability to subdue it. And this subjugation gets subtly but violently extended to finite individuals, what Laruelle calls ordinary man, or minorities. Philosophical frameworks get applied to individuals, we apply them to ourselves, so that they determine and limit our lived experience in an authoritarian mode. In contrast, a minoritarian thought like Laruelle's commences from the finite person, making philosophy subject to them as their material at their disposal. Just as Laruelle can provide a truly decolonizing reaction to otherness, described earlier, this non-philosophical minoritarian critique is a real and subversive critique of fascism. This is because it doesn't commence from a position of authority, but demonstrates the possibility and practice of a unidirectional thought from the real, from the immanence of ordinary man, which constitutes an automatic critique of authority. Automatic, meaning that the very existence of minorities, your existence, not in the sense of philosophical individualism, but in the finite sense, its persistence and defiance despite philosophy's best efforts to circumscribe it, is itself a lived critique. Though I must add that this is my simplification and a risky extension and application of Laruelle's thought. It's a reading that leans more on his early works like A Biography of Ordinary Man. And he would later become more careful to not frame the critique in terms of authority and defiance, as these concepts still operate within the binary of philosophical decision. I won't go into detail about philosophical decision in this essay, and only say that it's Laruelle's understanding of the structure of philosophy, a structure every philosophy shares, which breaks the real in two, i.e., immanence and transcendence, before synthesizing it. But not in the Hegelian sense. I should clarify that when Laruelle talks about philosophical decision, he's not just referring to obvious divisions in philosophy like Hegel's dialectic or Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena. For Laruelle, even staunch materialist philosophies or philosophies of pure immanence like Deleuze's still operate within the structure of philosophical decision. The issue isn't about specific philosophical positions and is more general, concerning the structure of thought that leads to any position whatever. It's about philosophy's fundamental presumption that it can adequately capture or represent the real through its concepts. This is what Laruelle calls the principle of sufficient philosophy, philosophy's self-authorized belief in its ability to provide adequate access to the real. An equivalence or parallelism between thought and the real is what makes up this divided and unitary nature of philosophy, its performance, called philosophical decision. And it was always Laruelle's intention to think outside this structure, hence the necessity of an automatic critique because it does not hinge on a philosophical decision. It does not attempt to describe the real at all. It is the real. The real is its own critique of philosophy. It is less about directly opposing philosophical authority or authority in the most general sense, which always subsists from philosophy, deriving its legitimacy from philosophical frameworks that serve to justify it, and more about rendering all these claims over the real now secondary and subordinate to it. Laruelle responds to the potential applications of this critique back on himself by establishing certain axiomatic rules for non-philosophy. Through determination in the last instance, Laruelle's thought doesn't claim to capture or represent the real as philosophy does. Instead, it operates according to the real without presuming to contain or master it. These self-imposed constraints are specifically designed to prevent non-philosophy from falling into the trap of philosophical decision and maintain its posture of radical immanence. Minorities, or ordinary man, is already given in the real, prior to any philosophical determination. Philosophy, as a form of decision, attempts to circumscribe the real, but remains secondary to it. The persistence of the ordinary man is not a defiant or critique in the traditional sense, but a manifestation of the real's radical immanence, which philosophy cannot fully capture or subordinate. Non-philosophy begins from this immanence, treating philosophy as mere material rather than an authoritative framework. A biography of ordinary man is where Laruelle develops his concept of a minoritarian thought, and if you only read one of his books, this is the one I recommend. It contains what feels like the first raw thrust of non-philosophy and is less careful than later works, making it slightly more accessible, though there are still extremely challenging sections and topics, particularly concerning non-thetic transcendence. Laruelle continued to refine and change his terminology throughout his career to try and correct misunderstandings while also refining and developing his ideas, leading him in later works to spend time solving tangential problems and technicalities. At least they feel like tangents from the perspective of someone new to Laruelle's thought. Now that he's gone, the scope and limits of the task of translating all of Laruelle's works into English has been set. Of his 29 books, I've counted 14 that have been translated into English, plus 2 essay collections. I've tried to show here the uniqueness and value of his work, especially in its ability to help us think in new ways that, to me, feel increasingly necessary. I'm grateful to the translators because without them, I wouldn't have been able to read these works that have had such an impact on my thought and writing, and I hope we can see more translations in the future and that Laruelle's clandestine thought can be discovered by more people.